On a cold afternoon in January, a neighborhood in Boston was sitting on top of 2 million gallons of molasses. Nobody there thought of it as a threat. They thought of it as the tank down the street. This was Boston's North End, a dense, working-class neighborhood, home to thousands of Italian immigrant families packed into tenement housing along narrow streets. Kids played in the alleys. Horse carts delivered ice and coal. And towering over all of it, a 5-story steel tank that had been there for years. Boston in 1919 had already survived a world war and a flu pandemic that killed thousands of people. Nobody there could have guessed a tank of molasses would be the next disaster. Most residents had never given the tank a second thought. It had simply always been there, the way a street lamp or a water tower fades into the background of a street you walk every day. The tank had been leaking since the week it was first filled. Neighborhood children would walk up with tin cups and scrape molasses straight off the seams, treating a structural failure like free candy. Some residents reported the leaks directly to the company that owned it, Purity Distilling, a subsidiary of United States Industrial Alcohol. Nothing changed. Instead of fixing the leaks, the company simply painted the tank brown, the color of molasses, so the problem would be harder to see. The tank existed because of the war. Molasses could be converted into industrial alcohol, and that alcohol was going straight into munitions. Demand was high, and so were the profits. So when the company needed a massive new storage tank, they built it fast. About 2 months, for a structure meant to hold over 2 million gallons of liquid. It was never tested with water first, the way a tank that size should have been. It went straight from construction to full of molasses. Just days before the disaster, the tank had taken on a large new shipment of molasses from Puerto Rico, noticeably warmer than what was already inside and still actively fermenting. Fermentation produces gas, and inside a tank with steel walls that were already too thin, that gas had nowhere to go but to keep adding pressure. There's a strange irony buried in the timing. The very next day, January 16, 1919, the United States ratified the amendment that would ban alcohol nationwide. Prohibition. The industry this tank existed to feed was about to be outlawed anyway. Nobody in that neighborhood knew that yet, on January 15th. There was another problem nobody understood yet in 1919, the way steel behaves in the cold. The plates used to build the tank were thinner than they should have been. And the steel itself had a flaw at the molecular level, a low-grade alloy that turns brittle at low temperatures. In warm weather, steel like that can bend under stress. In cold weather, it just cracks. Engineers wouldn't fully understand this kind of failure, what's now called brittle fracture, until disasters like this one forced them to study it. On January 15, 1919, the temperature did something strange. 2 days earlier, it had been bitterly cold, well below freezing. By midday on the 15th, it had jumped to nearly 40 degrees. A swing that fast puts sudden, uneven stress on metal that's already failing quietly from the inside. Some who survived described feeling the street itself vibrate beneath their feet seconds before they saw anything at all, like the city had taken a breath right before it screamed. Just past noon, people nearby started hearing a sound like gunfire, rivets shooting out of the tank's seams, one after another. Witnesses described the ground shaking, like a train running underneath the street. Others said the tank itself seemed to groan right before it gave way completely. What came down the street wasn't water. It was a wave of raw molasses, estimated at 25 feet high, moving at nearly 35 miles an hour. It was thick enough to hold on to anything it touched, and fast enough that almost nobody nearby had time to run. Right next to the tank stood the firehouse for Engine Company 31. The wave hit it directly, lifting the building clean off its foundation and slamming it down again. Firefighters inside were thrown against the walls and buried under debris and molasses as the structure came apart around them. Nearby buildings that should have been destroyed were spared only by which direction the wave happened to curve. A difference of luck, not design. At almost the same moment, an elevated train was approaching on the tracks above Commercial Street, completely unaware of what was happening below. The train's operator saw the wave coming and managed to stop it just before the section of track ahead was destroyed. Seconds later, the wave tore through the support structure underneath. A few seconds slower, and that train could have gone down with it. Up and down the street, buildings were crushed. Carts and automobiles were swept off their wheels. A section of the elevated railway's support structure was knocked over entirely. People and horses caught directly in the wave's path weren't simply knocked down. The molasses was thick enough to trap them exactly where they stood, and as it cooled in the winter air, it began to harden around them. Word spread fast, and help arrived from every direction. Boston police rushed to the scene. Sailors and cadets from a nearby Navy training ship waded directly into the wreckage. Witnesses later described the chaos as something closer to a war scene than a city street. Sirens, shouting, people calling out names into the wreckage, not knowing who was still under it. Rescue workers had to move through molasses that was now knee-deep, then waist-deep in places, every single step slower than the one before it. Survivors later said the smell alone was overwhelming. Thick, sweet, and inescapable, clinging to clothes and skin for days no matter how many times people washed. Some victims were pulled out alive. Others weren't found until the molasses around them was finally cleared away, days or even weeks later. By the time the search ended, 21 people were dead, and around 150 more were injured. Because the molasses kept hardening as it cooled, some of the missing weren't recovered for weeks. In the days that followed, the North End buried its dead. Neighbors who'd lived beside that tank for years, never knowing it would be the thing that finally took them. Cleanup took even longer than the rescue itself. Crews pumped in salt water from the harbor, trying to break the molasses down enough to wash it away. It only partly worked. For months afterward, Bostonians reported finding molasses everywhere, on trolley seats, on telephone receivers, tracked into homes on the soles of people's shoes. None of this had to happen. People in that neighborhood had watched the tank leak for years, and nothing about it ever changed, until the day it was too late for that to matter. The company's first move afterward was to blame anarchists. There had been real anarchist bombings in the years before, and it made for a convenient story. It didn't hold up under scrutiny for long. What followed was one of the longest civil cases in Massachusetts history. More than 100 separate lawsuits were eventually combined into a single proceeding. An auditor named Hugh Ogden was appointed to weigh the evidence, and the hearing stretched on for roughly 6 years. Engineers for both sides testified, going line by line through the tank's design, its steel thickness, and exactly how it had been built. Some of the same engineers who built skyscrapers and bridges across the country were called in to explain exactly how a tank that size should have been designed, and exactly how this one wasn't. It remains one of the largest engineering negligence cases in American history up to that point, and one of the first where a company couldn't simply walk away from a disaster it caused. In the end, the verdict wasn't close. The tank had never been properly tested before it was filled. The steel was too thin for what it was meant to hold, and it had never once been reviewed by a qualified engineer. The company was found responsible and ordered to pay damages. The case became part of the reason cities started requiring engineers to formally certify their calculations before a structure like that could ever be built again. But unlike a pandemic or a war, this one had a name attached to it, a company that could be sued, and a verdict that could actually change how the next tank got built. It's one of the earliest cases where an industrial accident directly reshaped how structures get approved in America. Not through a new law passed in a hurry, but through 6 years of engineers proving, point by point, what should have been obvious from the start. Today, the Great Molasses Flood is still taught in engineering schools, one of the clearest early examples of what happens when material science gets ignored under deadline pressure. It's a case study now in how easy it is to normalize a warning sign simply because nothing bad has happened yet. For decades, the disaster mostly faded from public memory outside of Boston. In 2003, a writer named Stephen Puleo published the definitive account of the disaster, pulling the story back out of obscurity for a new generation of readers. Today, there's a small marker near the site, easy to walk past without noticing, much like the tank itself once was. More than a century later, most people who walk through that part of Boston have no idea what happened beneath their feet. Locals have claimed for decades that on hot summer days, you can still catch the faint smell of molasses in that part of the North End. There's no real way to confirm that, but more than 100 years later, people are still telling that story, which may be the only memorial a disaster like this was ever going to get. Not a monument, just a smell nobody can quite prove is real, and a story that refuses to fully disappear. If a story like this is the kind of thing worth knowing, there's more of it here. And the next one is just as easy to overlook the first time you hear it.